All right, class, it is now Tuesday. This is our social studies video. I'm just going to go ahead and say pardon me as I have the same sheet as you, but I'm using it as my teaching tool. So just so you know, so that you guys can be following along perfectly well with me on this, okay? But today we're going to be talking about kind of the preamble to the Civil War, things that kind of led towards the Civil War before it actually started. And a big proponent of that was slavery, because as states were getting admitted, we'll see this, as states were getting admitted and there was fighting over whether they should be free states or slave states, it made the South want to start seceding. So we're going to jump right in with these notes. I'll tell you when the blanks are and where to fill those and what to fill those in with, okay? So the first thing to point out is that slavery was allowed into the United States from the time of the Constitution. So even when the Constitution happened, slavery was allowed. A lot of it, people in the South thought that slavery was necessary for the Southern economy to prosper, to succeed, and so it needed to be kept. And a lot of that, again, remember the cotton gin? So when Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, it increased the need for slaves because of how much more cotton could be produced at that time. And then the North, obviously, if the South was for it, the North was against it. They thought it was immoral, which means bad, and should be abolished, okay? So we're looking at early slavery dates now. The first one is 1619. The first enslaved Africans arrived in Jamestown, Virginia. So that blank should say Jamestown, Virginia. Okay? So they arrived in Jamestown, Virginia. Many years after that, in 1783, so we are now the United States. Massachusetts, the Supreme Court in Massachusetts, declares that slavery is now illegal in Massachusetts. So there's no more slavery in Massachusetts. Within the next 20 years, we see, so that next line should say MA, or Massachusetts. I know there's not a whole lot of room because they abbreviated it for MA. On the next line where it says 1784 to 1804, here I'm going to list them kind of quickly, but bear with me. It was New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, and New Jersey. They all abolished slavery within those next 20 years. All right, so far we have a lot of the northeastern states that are going, you know what, no, this really isn't right, we're going to abolish it. And then in 1808, so about 4 years after that was happening, in 1808, slavery importation, so that next word should be importation, was abolished, as in you can no longer bring slaves from Africa into the United States. That's what importing is bringing something into the United States, and they're no longer allowed to do that as of 1808. And then by 1860, there was 3 Western countries that allowed slavery, which were Brazil, Cuba, and the U.S. So places like France and England didn't have slavery at this point. All right, so we're going to talk about the Compromise of 1850. This is a big thing, okay? So the first line is California is a free state. California was a free state. So on the next line, Utah and New Mexico territories. So they kind of left it up to the people that live there to decide, do we want to be a free state or do we want to be a slave state? Again, I apologize that I'm going through this so quickly, but feel free to rewatch this video as many times as you need. All right. Then came the Fugitive Slave Law. So that's that next line under the California and Utah stuff. That very next line is the Fugitive Slave Law, which pretty much meant that slaves, stop biting that please, which meant that slaves had to be returned to their owners, even if they escaped to free states. So let's just say that Illinois is a free state and Mississippi was a slave state, because at that point, that's pretty much how it was. So let's say that somebody escapes from Mississippi and they make it all the way up to Illinois. Well, Illinoisans, anyway, They were required by law to give the slave back to its owner in Mississippi. That's what the Fugitive Slave Law pretty much stated. That was part of the compromise of saying if you live in the North and slavery is abolished, great. But if you're in the South, we can't just claim you as free because you escaped and things like that. So it's kind of a compromise because it was saying you can have free states and free states can choose to be free, but you can't just let somebody that's escaped now suddenly be free. You got to give them back to their owner. Okay? Below that, in 1854, we see the KansasNebraska Act, which brought into act popular sovereignty. So that's what that blank is. Popular sovereignty. And you may be going, what is that? And that's okay. Popular sovereignty essentially meant, for those two territories, by the way, just in those two. So it really, popular sovereignty means that the people in the states are the ones deciding. So it's kind of like a democracy. So the government, the overarching federal government, the ones in D.C., are not going to make this decision for the states, for the territories. They're going to let the people inside the territories and the government there decide if they want to be free or not. They're like, we're not going to tell you, you decide. So then they would. In 1857, there was Dred Scott ruling. Dred Scott went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ended up stating that slaves were personal property, essentially. They weren't even really people. In fact, if you look further, it says that Africans are black people are so inferior that they had no rights which a white man was bound to respect. Obviously, nowadays, we don't agree with that. But back then, the Supreme Court was like, nope, slaves are personal property, and black people don't have any personal rights, pretty much. Which is horrible, but this is part of what led, it's building tension. It's part of what led to the Civil War. All right? And then really quickly, we're just going to look at some abolitionists. Abolitionists means people that want slavery abolished. People that were against slavery. So the first line is Quakers. Quakers are a sect of kind of like Christianity. They're a little bit different, but they oppose slavery for religious reasons. So they were like, we don't believe that slavery is okay for our religious reasons, and so they were fighting for slavery to be ended. Next line, we have William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison. So he was a white abolitionist, and he wrote what was called The Liberator. It's kind of like a newspaper, and it called for immediate freedom, being like, let's not just keep going on and going on and going on. Let's just free everybody right now. Okay? Next is Sojourner Truth. That's a little weird. It's S-O-J-O-U. S-O-J-O-U-R-N-E-R. Sojourner Truth. She was a freed slave who spoke openly against slavery. So she was freed, and then she spoke publicly and openly against slavery. Next is Harriet Tubman. I'm sure many of you have heard of her. So she was also an escaped slave, not just freed, like Sojourner. She was escaped. She worked on the Underground Railroad, which was getting people safely from the South to the North to be free, and in a hidden way, so that their owners wouldn't find them. So she saved over 300 slaves from slavery, which is amazing. That's so many people. And she never lost anybody. Nobody ever died on her watch. And then during the Civil War, she acted as a spy. And after the war, she started a retirement home for former slaves. Next, we have Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass. He was a powerful writer, and he wrote narratives about slavery. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which talked about the evils of slavery. And then finally we have John Brown, who was a violent abolitionist. So he was violent towards people that were pro-slavery. All right, I know that that's a lot, but those are some of the important people leading up to and during the war. And then these are kind of some events, some big events that happened to cause more clashing in between the Confederacy and the Union. Okay?